I am really impressed now. If you came back for chapter 3 after surviving chapter 1 and 2, it's got to mean one of 2 or 3 things. It either means you are really enjoying this stuff, you've got a choice, you have no choice because you got to take the class, or you couldn't figure out how to drop. Well, I hope it's number 1. I hope you're really enjoying this stuff. I put a heavy load on you in chapters 1 and 2, but we had to build that foundation. So I guess I should go back and say, welcome to Business 101, Introduction to Business, Chapter 3, Global Markets. We're going to talk about the fact that business is global now. It's not just in America, business is worldwide. And we even have almost like a worldwide economy in a lot of ways as well, in addition to our own United States economy. All right. I did kind of, I think, promise you 1 or 2 things as I was going through chapter 1 and 2. So I'll see if I can kind of keep my word on that. Chapter 3 has to do with, again, global markets. What's made these global markets possible? Why didn't we do a lot of global trade? Well, I think you would agree with me that global trade is here now. Just like e-commerce, buying and selling on the internet is with us and it's increasing, trade among nations all over the world, that's with us. And it's getting larger. Why weren't we doing that in 1950? Yeah, we didn't have the technology. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have the communication capabilities. We didn't have the transportation or travel capabilities. In 1950, the world was a big old place. Here and there, but you know, the world has gotten much closer together now. We can communicate and talk and travel and buy and sell all over the world now relatively easily. Now there's still some nations that that aren't involved in this, as they're just evolving nations and that sort of thing. But global trade is a big thing. Is global trade good for the United States? Sure, we're able to sell our products to other nations and everything. Now, if you are into geography, you may be in a state of shock here. This we know is the United States, Canada, and Mexico. I don't know if that's where Australia is supposed to go, and I don't know if this is where Canada is supposed to go. I'm pretty sure that's where Europe is supposed to be, okay? But just bear with me. It's okay. Just for chapter 3, just pretend as we're going through here and we're talking about these things. All right. Let's talk about exporting and importing. Now in chapter 2, that 3.5-hour chapter, no, not quite that long. In chapter 2, we were talking about keeping Mr. Economy healthy. We talked about, we checked Mr. Economy's GDP, their gross domestic product, or the price or goods cost of, the cost of goods and services rising or falling. Or the total value, I should say, rising or falling. If the GDP goes up, that's a good thing. It means we're producing more goods and services as a nation. If it goes down, we talked about the unemployment rate. We talked about prices, how fluctuation in prices can create problems. And I said there were some other key indicators as well. And one of those that the economists just didn't use those 3. They probably used hundreds. But another one is global trade, how global markets and global trade is affecting the United States and Mr. Economy. So let's start this thing off. Exporting and importing. What is exporting and what is importing? And we'll focus obviously on our country, the USA. When the United States, a company in the United States sends something to Australia, what are we doing? We are exporting. we are exporting or we're sending them goods and or services. Does that make sense? What are they sending us? Let them think about it. That's not a quick trick question, but you have to think. If we send them goods and services, somebody over there, what are they sending back? Money. Money's coming back this way. Do we know, one thing we know about is this. One way to keep Mr. Economy healthy is having money in our economy for, creating wealth for people to be able to buy goods and services. So we've got money coming back. That's a good thing. All right, let's talk about what is importing. Importing, of course, as you know, sorry for the back, but importing is buying goods and services from someone else. You ever seen made in China on anything? And one of the things about things made in China, a lot of things that are made in China are products of American companies that they have outsourced to China. So, when you think about, well, this product was made in China, this was a Chinese product. Let's use that term. I think that's okay. It may not be. It may be a product that was maybe even at one time a product made in America. We found, remember in this pandemic, a lot of our medical supplies, our masks and things like that, were produced in the United States, outsourcing lower expenses being produced in China. Okay, but when you bring in goods and services into the United States, I'm sorry, that was very confusing. Let me see if I can get my error right. That's importing into the United States, goods and services. When you import goods and services in the United States, what are you exporting to that other country? Money. So, importing and exporting moves goods and services either into the United States or out of the United States, and moves money either into the United States or out of the United States. Importing, why don't we do importing and exporting? Ever think about that? I want you to be familiar with what importing and exporting is. Sometimes we import stuff because we don't produce it in the United States, or it can be produced cheaper in other nations. We've talked about that. Other nations import from us because we have products that maybe other nations don't have. There's just a number of reasons why importing and exporting goes on, and we have the capability of doing that now with the communications, internet, and that sort of thing. So is importing and exporting here to stay? Yep, it is. All right. If you had a choice, would you rather that the United States imported more stuff or exported more stuff? Well, to help Mr. Economy, it would be better if we exported more than we imported. That means we had more money flowing into our nation than flowing out. Okay, do you think as a nation we import or we export more? Unfortunately, we import more than we export. Now, well, let me say, I'll tell you what, I'll move that right now. And let me get this chair out of the way. If you look at your handout, you see where it talks about measuring global trade. One of the things that those economists do, they look at the balance of trade. What is the balance of trade, in our particular case, as far as America? Okay, then you're looking at, when you're looking at balancing trade, you're comparing imports to exports. If you import more than you export, you have a deficit balance in trade, or a trade deficit. If you export more than you import, you have a trade surplus. Okay? I put there, if you export more than you import, you have a trade surplus. If you import more than you export, you have a trade deficit. The United States has a trade deficit. And we have had a trade deficit since about 1980. Whew. Our trade deficit had gotten really, in the billions and billions and billions of dollars. Over the last few years, our trade deficit has gone down. I think part of that reason is we may be outsourcing less stuff and producing more in the United States. And I think we're going to find that as a result of this pandemic, I think we're going to find the importance of producing more and more things in the United States as well. But we are right now, we have had for a number of years a trade deficit also, although the deficit has lessened somewhat. Now, does a trade deficit by itself create a total disaster for Mr. Economy? No, it's just one of those factors that you look at. But if the trade deficit gets too large, it can give Mr. Economy a little bit of indigestion because more money is leaving the country than is coming into the nation. I want you to be familiar with what a balance of trade is, a trade surplus, and a trade deficit. Sometimes nations do things to try to protect the businesses within their nation. It's called trade protectionism, and I put that on our handout as well. If you want to protect some industries, things within your nation, you can utilize something called trade protectionism. And there's several things that you do as it relates to trade protectionism. You can put a tariff, one or two R's. I have two, I'm not sure that's right. You can put a tariff on goods coming into your nation. What is a tariff? If somebody said tax, that's right. In other words, goods and services coming in from China, like I have here. The United States could put a tariff on those goods and services, a tax on those goods. That means that when those goods and services come into the United States, they're going to cost more to purchase because they've put a tariff or a tax on that particular item that may make that item cost as much or more than United States products, which makes it less likely for people to buy that import and perhaps buy something in the United States. Okay? As a matter of fact, we put a lot of tariffs. We've put a number of tariffs, our present administration, on China on a lot of goods coming in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But a tariff is a tax. A second thing that you can do is you can do what's called an import quota. What's a quota? It's a limit, isn't it? Put a quota on something. So here's what you're doing. For something coming into our nation from another nation, you could put a quota, say, okay, you can bring in so many of this product, but once this number of those products come into our nation, then no more for the rest of the year or whatever period of time. Okay. That would be, so could you put a quota and a tariff? You could. You could put a tariff on a product and you could put a quota on a product. Now the third thing that you can do to kind of trade, and that's to kind of protect the people in the United States, the businesses in the United States. A third thing you can do is an embargo. That's where you decide to totally not trade with another country, a complete ban on imports from that country. Now I will say this. Most of the times, embargoes are for political reasons. Most times, quotas and tariffs are for economic reasons. sometimes Louisiana, the seafood industry is incredibly important. Shrimp, that sort of thing. There are times when shrimp and other items of seafood are imported into the United States from other nations. That really can hurt our seafood industry here in the United States, especially in Louisiana. So there have been times where tariffs or quotas have been put on those kind of products coming into the United States so that our U.S. suppliers of those seafood products are not put out of business or can be profitable in producing those products. Does that make sense? That makes sense? A question I ask a lot of times is this. Okay, well, here's what we'll do. We'll just put tariffs and import quotas and embargoes, primarily these two, on all kinds of nations to make sure that all of our companies in the United States are always have a trade advantage over every other nation. And that solves that problem. And that solves our balance of trade. But here's the deal. What's the problem with us solving the balance of trade, with us helping Mr. Economy by simply putting tariffs and import quotas on everything coming in from everywhere? Sounds like a good deal to me. Well, I hope one of you out there, or maybe 3 or 4 of you have said, well, they could do it to us. That's true. They could do the same thing to us that we do to them. All right, right now in 2020, we are importing more than we are exporting. So if we do that to them, and then they do that to us, who's going to get hurt worse? We are. Because we got more to lose because we're importing more stuff. So you say, well, where are you going with this? Here's where I'm going with this. Are we going to utilize some tariffs and some protection, some tariffs and some import quotas to help certain businesses, certain situations within our economy? Yes, we are. But we've got to use it properly, and we've got to use it at the right time, and we can't go overboard with it because we've got to do it selectively. Because what we can do to them, they can do to us. And remember, it's all a balance. It's all a balance. So there are times we may use it to protect a particular industry or things like this, but we can't just blanket do this because any other nation could do the same thing. So I'd like for you to be familiar with what tariffs, import quotas, and embargoes are. I'm looking at your handout for Chapter 3. You notice it's kind of a short handout. It's half a page, the way I'm looking at it here. That's encouraging, huh? All right. There was something that I was looking at. Sometimes there's another little term that I didn't put in the box that I wanted you to be familiar with, and I didn't mention it in Chapter 1, so let me mention it here. Sometimes when a company, when they go down into another country and they build a building, they build a facility, they build a business in that other country. McDonald's Corporation builds a McDonald's or McDonald's in Mexico. Walmart builds or buys buildings for Walmarts in Mexico or in Europe or wherever it wants to be. That's called, be familiar with this term, a direct foreign investment. When a company goes into another nation and actually purchases land and puts up a building and invests and brings about a business in that nation, that's called a direct foreign investment. We do direct foreign investments in other nations. Other nations do direct foreign investments within the United States. You can see here, so far I think we know what exporting and importing is. I think that we understand when we import, we send money out. When we export, we bring money in. We understand what a trade surplus, a trade deficit is. We want to understand that. We understand that sometimes in some situations you want to utilize trade protectionism. And that would be utilizing tariffs, import quotas, and embargoes. And I think we understand that. And I want us to be familiar with all of those things. There's 2 or 3 other things. The WTO. You see where I wrote that down? The WTO, I'm not going to write it down since I meant, that's the World Trade Organization. WTO. With all this trade among businesses and all these different nations, do you think sometimes there could be a trade dispute? There's a dispute between nations or between companies? Well, sure. Okay, how is that resolved? The World Trade Organization is kind of like getting the Good Housekeeping seal of approval or being a member of the Better Business Bureau. Nations that want to trade internationally, they basically need to play by the same set of rules. The World Trade Organization is the organization that sets the rules for world trade so that world trade can be done in a fair manner. If a country really wants to trade internationally, they become a member of the World Trade Organization and they say we'll abide by the rules of the organization. If disputes come up, the World Trade Organization will then mediate or solve those disputes. The WTO, they're kind of like referees, black and white shirts. They referee, throw a flag, and settle disputes as it relates to trade among nations in the world. I'd like for you to be familiar with what the WTO, the World Trade Organization, does. Now you may say, well look, I don't want to play by the rules, so I just won't join the World Trade Organization. Remember the land of Lane? We just won't join the WTO. Well, here's the deal. If you don't join the WTO, other nations trade with you because they know you're kind of being an outlaw. So if you really want to engage in international trade, global markets, you're going to need to be a member of the WTO. And they kind of referee what goes on. Second thing is the common market. Now, since I've already butchered up Europe over here, I'm going to butcher up Europe a little bit more. I think England's out here somewhere. All right, here's Europe. We've got all these nations in Europe. You know, there's Spain and there's Portugal. I mean, there's all these nations. Okay. All these nations in Europe, you know, a lot of the nations in Europe are about the size of states in the United States. So let's say that you've got the nation, let's say you've got Portugal. All right, Portugal as a nation. Do you think Portugal has very much political clout? Do you think Portugal has a lot of political clout with the United States? Probably not. They're a small nation. So what's happened a lot of times, nations have banded together for trading purposes. So what's happened is a lot of these nations have banded together in Europe for trading purposes. Now that doesn't mean that they've changed up their nations. Their nations are still the same. But for trading purposes, they do 2 things. They pretty much have free trade among their nations. In other words, they do very little tariffs or import quotas. They make it very easy for one nation to trade with another nation. Just like we make it very easy for you to trade Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas to trade with each other. There's no restrictions there. Well, that's pretty much the idea here. And then, as it relates to trading with other nations, they trade as a block or as a common market. This is going to go off the screen, but they trade as a common market. Instead of Portugal cutting deals with the United States or Spain or something like this. By the way, you do know what this is called. You've heard of this. Is called the European Union. And by the way, they did something even addition. They came up with one currency. You know what it's called? Euro. So instead of each of these nations having their own currency, they all have the euro. And so the idea and you've got common markets in Europe, you've got common markets in South America, you've got common markets in the Far East, you've got common markets in the Near East. There's all kinds of places, where nations have banded together for trading purposes, to make trade easy among their nations, and also to trade as a block of nations with other nations. That's a common market. Now, I'm going to give you some old news right here. Because I wrote down, did you see I wrote down Nafta? All right. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have come up with a common market. It used to be called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it was a common market among our three nations as far as trade is concerned. It allowed very free trade among our three nations and that sort of thing. There was a good and bad to that. Two of our biggest trading partners as far as the United States is Canada and Mexico. So we export lots of stuff to them, and that's a good thing. But remember this outsourcing? When we talked about outsourcing, we outsourced stuff, say, to Mexico City, and it was brought right back in the United States and put in those warehouses and sold. And we talked about how that could be kind of a problem for Mr. Economy. The reason why you could outsource to Mexico and then just move it right back in the United States is because we had this deal among our three nations, the North American Free Trade Agreement. We were a particular type of common market. So again, everything kind of has a balance. Now, a couple of things has happened. Our administration, President Trump and his administration, felt like that the market, the common market, the deal that we had, the tax agreement, the trade agreement, that we had with Canada and Mexico was not to the advantage of the United States. That it worked to our disadvantage. So NAFTA, and I want you to be familiar with what NAFTA is, a North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA has now been replaced by another trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. I can't remember exactly what they called it. I'll try to get that for us if remember when we do the next chapter, just so you'll know. But I want you to be familiar with what NAFTA is, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's that trade agreement among our three nations, Canada, United States, and Mexico. And I want you to be familiar with what a common market is. All right. One other thing, if you've been paying attention to the news at all over the last 6 or 8 months before this pandemic, we were putting some serious tariffs on China. And China said, we're going to put some serious tariffs on you. And boy, there was some fussing and fighting going on. And President Trump and his administration said, we didn't have fair trade deals with China. Our trade agreement was not advantageous to the United States. China had the advantage. It wasn't a fair playing field. So he imposed all these tariffs, and they got up kind of like two big bullies, and they were kind of. But what happened was, as a result of all this tariff and threatened tariffs and this sort of thing, China and the United States did sit back down at the negotiating table and have worked out a new trade agreement, which in all indications is much fairer to the United States. And one of the things it does, part of that trade agreement is China buying a lot more agricultural products from the United States, which is great for us here in the South, and especially in Louisiana. Ladies and gentlemen, I have finished chapter 3. Whoa! All right, huh? A little bit faster than chapter 1 and 2. As I mentioned, those chapters are just really difficult, not difficult, but there's so much in them. But this takes care of chapter 3. I want you to be familiar with importing and exporting. I want you to be familiar with balance of trade, trade surplus, trade deficit. I want you to be familiar with what a tariff, an import quota, an embargo is. I want you to be familiar with what the World Trade Organization is, the referee for international trade. I want you to be familiar with what a common market is, a group of nations that join together for trading purposes. And I want you to be familiar with what Nafta is. Nafta was a trade agreement between and among Canada, United States, and Mexico. That finishes chapter 3. I think ethics is the next chapter, and so I'm going to get ready to do ethics here pretty quickly, but I've got to do the loud clap of the hand to let my executive producer, Ryan Pierce, know that we have finished chapter 3, and I will see you in chapter 4. Thank you very much.